Just after midnight on the 4th of November, guards were sweeping through the storerooms and pathways of Parliament. In just a day's time, the king, including his relatives along with the entire nobility, the 12 senior judges of England, the members of the Privy Council, and the majority of bishops of England would gather for a parliamentary session. When the search led to the cellars directly under the House of Lords, there they found a startled man standing next to 36 barrels of gunpowder and coal. He would later come to be known as Guy Fawkes, a Catholic. Fawkes will forever be synonymous with the plot and that infamous date, but in truth he played only a minor role. To understand what led to the Powder Treason, we have to go back almost a century. In early February in the year 1530, William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, peremptorily thrust Oxford University into the center of the controversy of the hour. He wrote to the Vice-Chancellor, asking him and Oxford's academics to provide a unanimous opinion of the validity of the marriage of King Henry VIII to Catherine of Aragon. The request was as untactful as it was unwelcome. Cardinal Wolsey, the university's wealthiest patron, had been arrested only the year before for failing to provide Henry with the verdict he was looking for. Fearing a repeat of events, Oxford was unwilling to give any answer at all. That afforded Cambridge no room for political maneuver, and so they were forced to give Henry the answer he wanted. But the king needed a unanimous decision amongst the two academic institutions in the country. It would take Oxford only 2 months to succumb to pressure from the throne. The sour taste it left in their mouths, however, would not be forgotten. Catherine was a Spanish princess and a devout Catholic. Her marriage to a young Henry was arguably little more than a diplomatic gesture to ensure improved relations with Spain, but their marriage had deteriorated by now as she struggled to provide Henry with a son. Instead, they had a daughter named Mary. The prospect of yet another civil war from a lack of a male heir was a real and genuine fear for Henry. But his attempts to legitimize a divorce in the eyes of the Catholic Church were not convincing many in the Vatican, nor in England itself. He would have to separate the nation from Rome to validate a wedding with Anne Boleyn, his new love, and that is exactly what he did. Crowning himself the head of the Church of England, Henry proceeded to change the national religion and further undermine the Vatican by evoking the Treason Act, a piece of legislation that effectively turned loyalty to the Pope in Rome into treachery to the English state. He then began the systematic dissolution of the monasteries, beginning with Oxford's religious houses that would be shut down and their assets stripped off, their land sold to the highest bidder, and their inhabitants turned out onto the streets. College after college was ransacked for its illuminated books, now seen as symbols of papist idolatry, which were carried out and destroyed. Scattered manuscripts were blown in the wind like autumn leaves. Rome, in a state of shock, turned to Pope Clement, who, in response, excommunicated Henry, signaling to English Catholics that Henry was now an illegitimate king. But by now, the bloodshed had begun, with the king's own Lord Vice-Chancellor amongst the first to refuse to swear to the oath, and was subsequently swiftly executed. Some 14 years later, royal agents called on Oxford again. This time they were the 11-year-old King Edward VI visitors, come to enforce his new prayer book, the first real doctrinal step toward Protestantism. However, when Edward died, Catherine's daughter Mary became Queen of England. Like her mother, Mary was a Catholic, and so the winds of reform blew across England once more. The ornaments and vestments hidden from sight during Edward's reign were triumphantly restored. Communion tables were quickly replaced with altars, and the Great Bible and the Book of Communion, all of which were demanded by Edward's agents, were summarily destroyed. Then had come marriage to the reviled King Philip of Spain, the burning of Protestants, affording her the nickname Bloody Mary, and a disastrous war with France, and with the stench of the execution pyres fresh in their nostrils, many awaited her death with impatience. When she died in November 1558, it was her half-sister Elizabeth who was to succeed her on the throne. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne, but crucially she was raised Protestant as her birth came after the Reformation. With this fact, many had hoped the persecution of Protestants Mary had inflicted would result in the country being reverted back to the new religion. But, at Mary's funeral, the Bishop of Winchester praised the dead monarch as a good and loyal daughter of the true church, referring to Elizabeth throughout as the other sister. If she had had any doubt as to the Catholic sentiment surrounding her, the Archbishop of York's refusal to officiate her own coronation made it abundantly clear. Her parents' marriage had never been recognized by the Catholic Church, who saw Anne Boleyn as nothing more than a concubine, and her own legitimacy of birth had long been a subject for parliamentary enactment. Just days before her father had her mother executed, Thomas Cranmer had annulled her parents' marriage, and Elizabeth, at a stroke, was both bastardized and disinherited. Her present claim to the throne rested on her father's will and the Succession Act of 1543. Within months of her coronation, she introduced the Act of Supremacy, which afforded her the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and the Act of Uniformity, which agreed the doctrine it should follow. It demanded each man and woman's presence at their parish church every Sunday and holiday day. Failure to do so, without reasonable excuse, would result in a fine for each offense, or the censure of the church and possible excommunication, with the consequent loss of civil rights. Going to church on a Sunday had long been a tradition inspired by faith, but enforced by the ecclesiastical courts, and over the centuries, the machinery of that enforcement had become powerfully efficient. The long arm of the Church's law reached the full length and breadth of England. It was this machinery, in place, fully operational and re-greased with parliamentary drive in place of the holy oil, that Elizabeth's ministers now used to unseat the religion that had devised it. The Catholic Church in England was hoist with its own petard. There were other requirements that followed. Subjects were not to speak in a derogatory fashion about the new prayer book, nor to cause a clergyman to use any other form of weekly liturgy than the one specified by the Queen's officers. The penalties for this ranged from hefty fines to life imprisonment. And, crucially, they were not to be caught defending the papal supremacy, not unless they were prepared to forfeit first their goods, then their liberty, then their life. The oath of supremacy, originally invoked by Henry VIII only for Mary to repeal it, was reintroduced to ensure allegiance to the English monarch above all else. It was specifically written to subvert Rome's authority over the Catholic population. The state would argue now, and during the trials of those involved in the Powder Plot, that the fundamental issue here was national security rather than religious oppression. But so long as they kept their weekly appointment at the Queen's new church and their mouths tightly shut, there was nothing to stop them from benefiting from Elizabeth's lenient attitude toward Catholicism. And this was lenience rather than a move toward outright religious tolerance, a lenience born of political realism. When, in the summer of 1562, a number of prominent Catholics approached the Spanish ambassador, and through him, Rome, to ask if they might worship in the Queen's new church, the answer they received, in the negative, was not considered absolute enough to act upon, so worship there they did. When many local priests became aware of the level of Catholic feeling in their parishes, they made adjustments accordingly, so Catholics might have Mass said secretly in their own houses by those very priests who, in church, publicly celebrated the Protestant liturgy. To compromise made sound political sense. The notorious 16th century Cambridge academic, Dr. Andrew Perne of Peterhouse, was known to have changed his religion 3 or 4 times to suit the change of ruler. But when Perne was asked by a close friend to tell her honestly and simply which was the holy religion that would see her safe to heaven, he replied, "I beg you never to tell anyone what I am going to say. If you wish, you can live in the religion which the Queen and the whole kingdom profess. You will have a good life, you will have none of the vexations which Catholics have to suffer. But don't die in it. Die in faith and communion with the Catholic Church, that is, if you want to save your soul." Perne never had the chance to heed his own advice. He died suddenly on the way back to his room after dining with the Archbishop of Canterbury, caught out not only in the wrong faith, but also in the headquarters of that faith, Lambeth Palace itself. In 1566, Elizabeth would arrive at the university's halls and attend debates and disputations, the art of which formed the basis of every student's education. On that Tuesday, a rising young Oxford star, Edmund Campion of St. John's College, would triumph in the natural philosophy disputation, proposing that the tides are caused by the moon's motion. The Queen was delighted with Campion's speech. Her personal advisors immediately offered to become his patrons. But it was indicative of the government's continued anxiety over the problem of Oxford's religious insubordination that one of them, William Cecil, had provided the students in advance with a list of preferred subjects for these debates. Thursday's Divinity Disputation took as its council-chosen theme whether subjects may fight against wicked princes, allowing little scope for awkward theological reasoning. It would have been a brave, and short-lived, undergraduate who dared to denounce Elizabeth's break with Rome as wicked to her face. More embarrassing and more damaging still to the royal party would have been a spirited and unopposed defense of the Catholic faith. Oxford's young students were to be given little opportunity to air their religious grievances, but Elizabeth favored the carrot over the stick whenever possible. On February the 28th of October 1558, a sailing ship beat its way slowly up to an English coast, gripped in fear after a Spanish armada intent on overthrowing the Protestant queen stalked the waters near home. On board were two young Englishmen, of whom the English government had every reason to feel afraid and suspicious. The pair were Catholic priests belonging to the Society of Jesus, and their intention was to succeed where the Spanish Armada had failed, to return English to the Catholic Church. If the Armada was the latest in a progression of Franco-Spanish enterprises, sanctioned by the Pope and designed to restore English Catholicism through force of arms, then these two young men represented Rome's second line of spiritual attack, force of argument. Neither man had been long enough in Rome to forget the seeping chill of late October English rain. The bad weather that had so hampered the Armada had not abated, and the year was ending with as cold a spell as it had begun. One of them was a 24-year-old John Gerard. He was born on the 4th of October, 1564, the son of the prominent Lancashire landowner Sir Thomas Gerard, a former county sheriff. At the age of 5, John Gerard was removed from his parents' care when it was discovered his father was involved in a scheme to rescue the newly imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, and restore her to the Scottish throne. Sir Thomas Gerard was arrested and held in the Tower of London until 1573. On his release, he collected his 8-year-old son from the family of strangers on whom he had been forcibly billeted, and returned with him to Lancashire, to Bryn Hall, the Gerards' estate. Whatever the effect on John Gerard of being ripped from his home at so young an age, these events did little to persuade him to conform to the state church. At the age of just 12, he was sent down from Exeter College, Oxford, for refusing to attend a Protestant Easter service. In the summer of 1577, Gerard applied for and received a license to travel abroad to study. For the next 3 years, he attended lectures at Dr. William Allen's English College. Allen, an exiled Oxford academic, had opened the college as a training school for those English boys still wishing to enter the Catholic priesthood, now that this was forbidden to them in their own country. The college also offered a thorough education to any English student unwilling to swear allegiance to the new Church of England, an oath required of all those graduating from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. At Reims, Gerard first came into contact with a member of the Society of Jesus, an English Jesuit named Lovell, and from Reims he traveled to Clermont, the school of the French Jesuits near Paris, determined to join the society himself. He was not yet 16. The Society of Jesus was a new religious order, founded in 1540 by a Spanish ex-soldier called Ignatius Loyola, with the specific aim of converting the heathen and reconciling the lapsed. Loyola dreamed of countering the rise of Protestantism and restoring the Catholic Church to its former preeminence in Europe. To this end, he had brought all his army training to bear on the problem in hand. "I have never left the army," he explained. "I have only been seconded to the service of God." His Jesuits operated as a tightly knit organization, bound by a rigid, even military discipline. And Gerard, who used his time at the college to continue his studies, was quickly impressed by the elite band of priests who taught him. Gerard represented a rising inclination amongst Catholic intellectuals to restore and not abandon a country which they still considered their home. But the Spanish fleet had stoked the flames of anti-Catholic propaganda, he noted. Everywhere a hunt was being organized and their houses searched. The very presence of a Jesuit priest like Gerard would not only heighten the anxiety and suspicion, but validate the claim that they were in fact agents of a foreign state, intent on subverting the government. Young English priests might have been returning home to their family and friends, but at the same time they were entering an unfamiliar, hostile world, a beleaguered and suspicious England whose savagery had yet to be put to the test. And they were entering that world in secret, in disguise, in the very manner of the political secret agents their homeland believed them to be. Formidable, too, had been the challenge of establishing the mission at the start, of drawing together the dejected exiles from an Oxford university shattered by religious reforms, of schooling them in martyrdom and of dispatching them home in increasing numbers to face unknown perils. For his 9th task, Hercules had only to steal the Amazon Queen's belt, a gift she herself had been willing to grant him. John Gerard and his fellows were attempting to steal the souls of English men and women back to the Catholic Church, and to do so under the nose of the, perhaps, even more redoubtable English Queen. It was a labor that would come at a high price. The Queen's favorite, Edward Campion, would take a rather different path than was mapped out for him, for he would become a Catholic priest. Even though he and others before him would desperately declare their aim to be purely spiritual, as opposed to political, Parliament could not see how opposition to the official English Church failed to be a political act. Campion had always believed he was coming home to England to die. The night before his departure from Prague, a colleague had inscribed on the door above his cell, P. Edmundus Campianus, Martyr. Earlier, another priest had painted a garland of roses and lilies on the wall above his bed, the symbol of martyrdom. On the morning of the 1st of December 1581, Campion was led out from the Tower of London, through the driving rain and the mud-choked streets, to the scaffold, where a crowd assembled to witness his gruesome death. In May the following year, 7 more priests were executed. By now, the crowd was no longer cheering on cue, as the execution of Robert Southwell showed. It took the hangman pulling on his legs before Southwell's body had finally stopped moving, for the rope had been clumsily fixed around his neck. 3 times one of the attending officers moved in to cut him down alive, but the crowd reacted angrily, and from their number Lord Mountjoy stepped forward to stay the man. When the disemboweling was finished and Southwell's head was held aloft to the people, there was silence. No one was heard to cry, "Traitor, traitor," as before times they were wont to do. His head was set upon London Bridge, and his 4 quarters upon 4 gates in the city walls. The crowds were not always without compassion. Margaret Ward was charged with supplying the priest William Watson with a rope to escape from prison. Sympathetic onlookers claimed that as she climbed to her death, they could see she was crippled and half paralyzed by torture. Elizabeth herself was said to have been appalled by Ward's death, and it was for that reason that she recently pardoned 2 other women who had borne themselves before the tribunal with singular courage, wrote one account. The heart of the issue was, of course, the relation between religion and politics, and so in late December 1594, Gerard was led out to face his sternest test yet, at London's Guildhall before a panel of commissioners. The question put to him there, the so-called bloody question, went as follows. What would you do if the Pope were to send over an army and declare that his only object was to bring the kingdom back to its Catholic allegiance, and if he stated at the same time that there was no other way of re-establishing the Catholic faith, and commanded everyone by his apostolic authority to support him? Whose side would you be on then, the Pope's or the Queen's? This question summed up the English government's hostility toward the Jesuit mission. Moreover, it illustrated the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of the English Catholic position, a dishonesty that the missionaries themselves had done everything in their power, indeed had been trained, to ignore. Because, as things stood in this conflict, there were only two sides, the popes and the queens, and England's Catholics were attempting, for dear life no less than for their dearer faith, to pretend there were not. If you were Catholic, then Elizabeth was illegitimate. If Elizabeth were illegitimate, she had no right to occupy the throne, she was a usurper. Moreover, the Pope had confirmed her illegitimacy and had sought to depose her from that throne. Conclusion: if you are Catholic, then you must support that deposition. You must support the Pope. Except for two factors, which every English Catholic, missionary, and layperson with half a mind on survival now clung to with a fervor born of desperation. First, the full extent of the Pope's powers had always been a matter of dispute. It was an 11th century document, the Dictatus Papae, attributed to Pope Gregory VII, that laid claim, on the Pope's behalf, to supreme legislative power over all Christendom, including the right to depose monarchs. The history of Christendom was littered with examples of willful monarchs dictating policy and compliant popes obeying. Indeed, in the hands of a powerful king, a pliable pope could be the deciding factor in international disputes and personal rivalries, brought in to add a biblical seal of approval to a wholly political conflict. To add further uncertainty to the issue of papal power, the history of Christendom was similarly littered with examples of popes claiming authority over monarchs and monarchs choosing to turn a deaf ear. And this came stamped with the authority of Christ himself. Render unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's. Christ's response to a situation of potential dual loyalty similar to that faced by English Catholics now. Crucially, this response suggested that there was a distinction between spiritual and secular jurisdiction, and that Caesar had as much claim on a subject's obedience as God, so long as each kept to his own sphere of influence. The problem was, with the Pope claiming powers of deposition and the English religion a matter of parliamentary legislation, those two spheres did not just overlap, they were almost indistinguishable. In Elizabeth's England, there was nothing so helpful as Caesar's image on the back of a coin, to indicate where loyalty lay at any given moment. The bloody question was the government's attempt to impose from the outside, by means of a single interrogatory, a forced separation of the secular from the spiritual. Unfortunately for English Catholics, the bloody question was unanswerable. When Queen Elizabeth died in the early hours of 1603, it was Mary's son James who would succeed her to the throne. Despite a Protestant upbringing, James had made use of Catholic privy councillors, a Catholic captain of the guard, and Catholic diplomats in his dealing with foreign powers throughout his life, and this brought optimism within the Catholic populace that there would be tolerance afforded to them under the new king. It wasn't an optimism misplaced, as there were rumors James' toleration of Catholicism extended closer to home, when a report appeared that his wife had actually converted to Catholicism, and with equanimity commented, "Well, wife, if you cannot live without this sort of thing, do your best to keep things as quiet as possible." At this period, England was making peace with Spain, despite the lobbying of English Catholics in Spain and Rome. Some were making the extravagant claims about the number of Catholics they could muster in the event of Spanish invasion, and who were now begging King Philip of Spain to launch such an expedition. One of the men was called Anthony Dutton, and the other, Guy Fawkes. While the English Catholic community fragmented at this development, James' government was contemplating its next steps. In September 1604, Spain received from its envoy in London the leaked minutes of a private meeting between James and his councillors to discuss the mitigation of the Catholic fines. The Earl of Northampton, probably the source of the leak, opened the meeting, repeating James' position that he did not desire the blood of Catholics. From this starting point, the other councillors gave their opinions. Sir Robert Cecil advised, "I would not counsel your majesty to use such rigor against Catholics in that they govern themselves moderately, and well, for they intend nothing against the state of our country." Thomas Egerton, a lapsed Catholic, put the opposing view. The Papists are a dangerous people. Baron Kinloss followed suit, speaking to James's anxieties. Should your majesty not wish the laws to be enforced against Papists, undoubtedly their increase will be so great that they rise up against your majesty and expel you from this kingdom. Cecil responded, I have no fear of the rebellion of Catholics for sake of their religion, as I have never understood that any people has rebelled for sake of religion, but more for politics and matters of state under pretext of religion. The Earl of Dorset, James's treasurer, put the financier's point of view. It is necessary that there be an increase of either Papists or Puritans. I prefer the increase of the Catholics and not the Puritans, for the Papists are a peaceful people, and in their increase your majesty will derive much money from the collection of these fines again. But there was a plot already being devised, one of those involved being the cousin of Robert Southwell, to kidnap King James and persuade him to accede to their demands of less harsh treatment of fellow Catholics. Despite his initial signs that promised much hope, he failed to convince men like Robert Catesby, the architect and leading advocate of what would be known as the Gunpowder Plot.